One of the major breaking news stories from the last week is the announcements of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regarding the planned construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. On Sunday, December 4th, the announcement was made by the direction of the Obama administration. It stated that it refused to grant the final permit that would be needed to complete the $3.8 billion project to complete the oil pipeline that would run beneath the Missouri River Reservoir. Since this announcement has been made, the campsites of peaceful protesters against the pipeline have erupted with celebration. Things seem to be looking up for a moment for the Lakota people on South Dakota's Indian reservations, but there's still a lot that can be done to help this population of people. One way that Native Americans could be helped is finding ways to increase the funding of education on Indian reservations. I would like to welcome you to Takini, home of the Skyhawks. This is the front of a K-12 school on the Upper Cheyenne River Reservation, and specifically the school that I got the privilege of visiting this last summer. Walking into the school, you could instantly tell that this was a school that was a kindergarten class of budding artists, a middle school basketball team full of athletes, and a senior class full of scholars. You only had to look past what was right in front of you. The lights throughout the entire building was off during the summer in order to save electricity. The decades-old desks, chairs, and bookshelves were piled up in the hallway, and the empty classrooms they belonged in had molded into disintegrated carpet that was being pulled up or in the process of being pulled up. The walls of these classrooms were in a dire need of a fresh coat of paint, and in the main office of the school, the baseboards that ran all around the room were falling off the walls. Behind them were cobwebs, mold, and who knows what else. This building was in dire need of some TLC. In order to fix up schools on Indian reservations like Takini School, you need funds. This is something that's not abundant for these schools. We see that the infrastructure of Native American schools are falling apart right around the students, and many of the buildings are failing to provide basic needs such as water, heat, and electricity on a daily basis. The safety concern here is that students are trying to learn in environments that are not safe, and the school buildings are lacking basic necessities such as heat and water. Students who have certain health problems such as asthma are stuck in these learning environments that are going to exacerbate health conditions. And then we look at the fact that some of these buildings are so old that they contain hazardous materials. An example of this is the fact that the age of many structures in the United States, including schools located on Indian reservations, indicate that they contain building materials that are now found to be harmful to the student or to the human body. A specific example of this is a harmful substance called asbestos. This compound was commonly used in buildings for insulation. Now, when you do any sort of work on the building, the asbestos gets moved or disrupted, and then it starts to deteriorate. As the asbestos starts to deteriorate, it goes into the air, and then people inhale it into our lungs. And once they're in the lungs, it places the students and anyone else who's inhaled this harmful substance at risk for lung cancer and other severe lung conditions. This problem is then compounded by the fact that there's no money to fix the schools. So in the status quo, the buildings are just going to continue to fall apart while containing these hazardous materials that could harm the children. Another problem that we see with the education of these students is that most of the students that attend the Takini schools and many of the other schools on Indian reservations are in high poverty. We already know that poverty is high on Indian reservations, and then when we look more specifically at it, we see that poverty is something that lags across generations. This is why poverty is so commonly referred to as a cycle. Typically, the more education that an individual is going to receive, the less likely they are to live in poverty. This link between poverty and education has become even more clear within the last decade. Howard Rusk writes about the status quo on poverty on the Indian reservations and states there is a harsh profile of poverty. Unemployment is at 45 to 50%, housing 90% below acceptable standards, and the average educational level is only 5 years. It's very clear that this population of people live in poverty, and that causes many of the problems that are found on Indian reservations. Russ continues to state in his writing and talk about high death rates of children that occur on reservations due to severe alcohol problems, and this is something that we see is far too common on Indian reservations. But when we look specifically back at poverty in itself, we see that it's both a cause and an effect of education. This is mainly due to the inadequate access to education and then being unable to finish their education. Many of children have stopped going to school before they finish in order to take these low-paying jobs in order to help support their family. The unfortunate thing is once these children leave the education system, very few of them actually return to finish their education. Because most of them don't return, this permanently puts them in a place of poverty for the rest of their lives. We have to see that due to education being the break in the poverty cycle, it has to be considered a reducing risk to poverty. Well, we've talked about education and how the buildings are falling apart, and how poverty can be poverty is both cause and effect of education, and education can be considered a reducing risk for it. But how do we help education? We have to see that the funding in education is missing, and in order to help find the funding, we need to look into different places in order to find it. Usually the schools are funded by the local, federal, and state governments. Well, a new place to look for funding would be to look through private donations to help these Indian schools where the funds are lacking. However, the funds that they do have right now from private organizations are very concentrated, and it would be easier to disperse them and use them for multiple different programs to help the most amount of people. Instead of giving all the donations to one school, maybe a private one to help all the public schools. Proposed intervention like this could help alleviate some of the issues and their consequences, and would increase the education for funding for schools on the Indian reservations. One of the organizations that I think would be capable of doing this would be the Atka Museum and Cultural Center. This right here is a postcard that I got at the Atka Museum and Cultural Center when I went and visited. If you look closely, the postcard depicts a traditional Indian outfit, and this outfit is actually specifically my favorite one that was on display at the museum. The museum contains many displays like this, and all of the objects on display have been donated to them or specifically made for them. And I believe this one was a traditional outfit that was specifically made and given to the museum in honor of someone, if you want to take a closer look at it. So the Atka Museum and Cultural Center would be capable of doing this sort of funding for education. Instead of giving all of their private donations to private Indian schools, they could donate or help raise funds for the private schools on Indian reservations across the state. The issue that I see with this sort of proposal would be that many different parties believe that the education of America's youth is the burden of the federal and state government's hand, and there's no room for a hand for third parties, specifically these third parties being private organizations. With the assistance of both the state and federal governments, it can be presumed that there is not a need for private organizations to help fund education, and while this statement may seem true, it's also valid to say that it also depends on the interests of the people and other organizations. The funding from schools that comes from the state and local governments and the federal government as well is clearly not enough, as we already see the fact that there is an underfunding in the schools and the status quo. We see that they're falling apart, and it's not just the Indian schools on the Indian reservations, but honestly schools all across the United States. There's no funding to fix these buildings in the foreseeable future, and the children are just going to continue to go to school in unsafe conditions. This is exactly where funding from private organizations can play a hand in educating the youth of the Indian reservations. The gaps in funding for the schools are just going to continue getting larger and can be easily filled through the supplemental funding by private organizations such as the Atka Museum and Cultural Center. What we see is that, as I mentioned earlier, currently the Atka Museum and Cultural Center funds the St. Joseph's Indian School located in Chamberlain, South Dakota. This organization typically funds for the complete education of about 200 children every year to go to the private Indian school. And it would be great to see this organization expand from only supporting 200 children to go to a private school, but to supporting thousands of children, specifically Lakota children across the state of South Dakota, by funding special programs or helping with building maintenance. I think that this could be a very easy solution to the underfunded Indian schools in South Dakota. So, as we see with my research and what I've done on the education system in the American Indian youth, is that with the underfunded schools and the need for funding, that looking to private organizations would be a very good solution. This always related back to me to the saying of an African tribe, saying that it takes a whole village to raise our children, a whole village to raise one child. Everyone must share the burden, and everyone must share the joy. This is true when it comes to educating the children in the United States, and particularly those on Indian reservations. While the burden of funding education of children predominantly falls to the state and federal governments, it does not mean that there's not a vital role that these private organizations can play in education. The unique roles that private organizations such as the Otkin Museum and Cultural Center is to help fund schools and education program that there's right now little to no funding for, and using these private organizations to help fund the schools will help improve the education of children, allowing more or less the whole village to help raise the children of the entire village. Hopefully the next good news that we're going to hear about the Lakota people of South Dakota is that the schools are going to be using private donations in order to help alleviate some of the gaps in federal, state, and local funding. Thank you.